Hi all, I welcome you to the Building Culture podcast where I invite incredibly smart people who build things. Whether they be engineers, entrepreneurs, programmers, hobbyists, or researchers, it does not matter. As long as you're someone who's passionate about building things, I'll find you and podcast you. Hi, all. I want to take a brief moment to thank you all personally for supporting this podcast on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Google Podcasts and Spotify. The podcast mainly features interesting people in robotics, artificial intelligence, and entrepreneurship. If you believe that the information that I'm providing might be of benefit to you or to someone you know, it would be really great if you could hit the subscribe button and press the notification icon so that you can get notified on time whenever the next part is out. It would literally take you a second or two to subscribe to the podcast, but it would really mean a lot to me because I can grow the podcast to a level where I can reach more people, invite ever more interesting guests, and have a more meaningful impact. So let's begin now. Today's episode, I have the pleasure of having with us the robotics software engineer at none other than Boston Dynamics. He has been associated with working on a stretch robot at Boston Dynamics, where he was involved in design, implementation, and testing of behaviors for autonomous robots. He has also been part of the robust robotics group at MIT, where he worked on a system integration, software architecture, and robot experimentation. He has experience with multidisciplinary areas in robotics, ranging from computer vision, machine learning, control, human robot interaction, and so on. A part of his journey also features him as an educator, and he has been associated with MathWorks for creating a lot of quality content in modeling, simulation, and robotics for quite some time. That's an interesting journey that Sebastian was onto with MathWorks, where he was also involved in robotics competitions as part of creating these educational videos and content. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that he has also done, which I'll not go into details of. I'll just link his LinkedIn account in the description. So without any further ado, let's welcome Sebastian Castro.
Yeah, thank you for having me on this podcast. Hopefully, we'll have a great discussion, and thank you all for tuning in as well.
Thank you, Sebastian. I'm looking forward as well. So let's just begin with talking about your overall professional journey. If you can tell how you started with robotics and to what stage you are in, what are the ups and downs that happened, and how does your journey look like?
Sure. So I'll take the kind of the high level overview first, right? I actually came to the U.S. for my undergraduate studies. So I was fortunate enough to get into Cornell University, where I spent 5 years there doing both my bachelor's and my master's degrees in mechanical engineering. And mechanical engineering, I think, is a super broad field. I ended up really falling into the areas of system dynamics, feedback control, and that kind of bled into robotics a little bit. So by the time I was doing, kind of later on in my university career, I was doing my master's research in a robotics lab with my advisor, and that kind of started the passion for robotics. Like you were talking about with MathWorks, I actually ended up going there to work with MATLAB and Simulink after university, where I was, even though I worked on robotics, I became focused again on the kind of the controls, modeling, and simulation side of things. So I spent a lot of years at MathWorks or between two roles, really focused on that, right? So physical simulation of systems, controls, algorithms with MATLAB and Simulink. And it wasn't until kind of later on that I came back into the robotics field by transitioning to a job in the autonomous aerial vehicles industry, coming back to MathWorks, where I worked on robotics competitions and education, and that then led into my more recent appointments, like you said, at MIT and Boston Dynamics, where that's really where I started being a robotics software engineer in the true sense. think the other roles were more kind of on the supporting and education role, and it's been a nice mix. So that's kind
Yeah.
of the broad brush of everything.
Yeah, a really unique journey as well, right? Because normally, for example, a robotic software engineer would start with robotics, for example, and you started with something, of course, in engineering, but in a different area in aerospace and all, and then you moved on to robotics education, and you got a really cool opportunity there, and after that, you are now a full-fledged robotics software engineer. So, at what point did you decide that okay, robotics is something that I'm really passionate about? And of course, you got an opportunity, but before that, you would have the skills and the passion towards robotics as well. So, at what point did you decide that okay, yeah, robotics is the thing for me, and I should pursue it in a multidisciplinary way or handle it from different approaches?
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people when they answer this question, they'll say things like, when I was in middle school, I did robotics club, and it was, the thing I actually didn't even think that robotics was going to be a viable career opportunity, based on where I came from, right? During high school, I was always, you know, I have always been into math, physics, and all that, as many of us probably listening to this podcast have been. But my view of engineering was very different, right? It was I'm going to be, doing equations on paper, doing graphs and, building bridges or designing
Mm.
cars, like that. That's kind of the stereotypical engineering role. And I was fortunate enough that just during school, there was the opportunity to take classes that talked about robotics. I remember we had an introduction to robotics class, I think in my third year of undergrad, where I said, is this a thing? Like, do people do robotics? I'm just going to take the class and see what happens. And it became addictive because the thing about robotics is that there's so much that goes behind it. When you first hear of a robot, maybe you hear about like a little Arduino with two wheels driving around, or you hear about a robot arm, and you're like, oh, I guess robotics is, the math behind like spinning a wheel or turning a joint. And you're like, okay, that's cool, that seems like a challenging problem.
Yeah.
And then you kind of keep digging, and it's not just that, but actually, the building of the robotic system, doing like full engineering design. You're like, oh, that's cool. So robotics is both math and building. And then you're like, wait a minute, don't robots have cameras right now? Like, how do you do all of that? And it just keeps going. Like, there's so much
Yeah.
behind a capable robot, and the kind of the systems aspect of these, highly capable robots that have a little bit of everything, like the ability to move on the ground or fly or walk or manipulate, perceive the system. I don't know, that it brings together so many different
Disciplines.
things that we're trying to understand about the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So the
it's just
more you know, the more there is to know, right? And more fascinating stuff to discover and build. So that's the beauty of robotics. And also, as you mentioned, like it involves a lot of different domains, right? So yeah. And so where did you do your schooling? Like where are you from originally?
oh yeah. So I guess I didn't mention that part. I was born in Chile in South America,
Ah,
and when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I moved to Jamaica, which is where I did my high schooling. And that's also where I learned English, which was kind of a fortuitous thing to pursue a college career in the U.S. So yeah, I then came up here in the U.S. for university in 2006. I was at Cornell University in upstate New York, and very different experience from where I'd grown up. There was just a lot of exposure to. So again, like I didn't like an example that I gave you. I didn't think that robotics was like a viable thing that people did. I think I had a very different understanding of what engineering meant, because
hmm.
where I came from, engineering was more like foundational things like infrastructure, construction.
Hmm.
Like who's gonna tinker with robots? That's not a thing. That's sci-fi. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
So really getting that exposure in university and like learning that that was a viable path, and it was super interesting. That just kind of got me hooked. And since then I've been fortunate enough to be in jobs where I really get to work with the design of systems, the programming of autonomous systems, and I've gotten to touch a lot of different pieces of the engineering process in general, which a lot to learn, can be intimidating, but it's fun.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned twice already that the process of building robots or learning robotics or being involved in that is addictive. So can you elaborate on that? In what sense do you find it addictive?
Yeah, I think it's the fact that I don't know. I mean, I think the people that study robots, they they they're typically doing it, especially in the research field, to understand in some way how we behave, right? And this happens a lot,
Hmm.
particularly now in the kind of the AI space, where people are like relying more and more not just on like machine learning techniques, but also cognitive science to kind of draw upon. Well, how would a system learn to be self-sufficient with like minimal intervention or interaction with humans that is as natural as possible? And you're like, okay, well, that does that mean that I can start doing things that I can start interacting with robots in a way that is more like interacting with humans, and that you're starting to give more high-level commands to robots. You know, typically, or let me back up. At some point when you were programming robots, you were giving, very specific commands, almost like assembly language to the robot, and that was your interface to the autonomous system.
Hmm.
And as you get more to a natural interaction with robots, like higher level APIs, programming languages, frameworks, natural language, the user experience is made better, but there is so much fundamental science that goes inside of there, and that I think is, you know, that is the addictive part to me. It's the fact that like to get the robot to appear really simple and easy to interact with, and generally like to just make it look like it belongs in the world. It just takes so many people and like so many years of combined research from so many people to make it
Yeah.
work. And and just the amount of knowledge that is there is again what is super interesting but overwhelming at times.
Hmm. So the process of it basically, having these knowledge or information systems from different domains and seeing it in an actual product, let's say, and seeing the robot perform these things in real time as well. That yeah, how these concepts actually apply in the real world. So, also about your journey is, as we talked about, that you have been an educator. Also, at what point did you realize that let me try out, educating people on or making some content online for robotics? Because this is also, I mean, there's robotics engineers and not everyone would be wanting to be an educator or something, right? So, what actually, drove you in that direction?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of things that happen. I think I've always been kind of educationally minded in the sense that even when I was in university, I I enjoyed taking good notes and like sharing them with people and like helping people
Hmm.
explain concepts. And I've always liked that to some extent more than actually doing the engineering. Like, okay, so everyone has their strengths and weaknesses, right? Whether or not they want to admit it. And I think I'm better suited to be more of like a supporting role for people that frankly are better engineers than I am. Now, if I can help people kind of get to that point, like get through things that may be difficult for them to understand, like grasping
Hmm.
certain concepts or learning a programming language, I've always found myself a lot more effective in that sense, even since early on. Um, but again, it wasn't. I think it was through like opportunities at MathWorks that I really got to try out lots of different ways to actually educate people, and that really came up in the three positions that I had while I was at MathWorks. The first one was actually an entry level program where they just got a bunch of students out of their master's program, and half of what you had to do was actually technical support, where like paying MathWorks or MATLAB and Simulink customers would call you with all sorts of questions,
Ah,
and you
okay.
would have to help them out. And
Hmm.
like that's already one way of teaching people. Um, it being a rotation program, you also got to do projects with other teams. So I ended up doing projects with the training department within MathWorks, and that was my first kind of permanent job out of the entry level rotation, where I was writing training manuals for like modeling and simulation with Simulink. And through there, I kind of got in touch with another team, which is the kind of the third team that I then moved on to at MathWorks, which was a dedicated education marketing team. And in that one is kind of where the explosion of educational content came in, because that was actually my job, to make YouTube videos, to make tutorials, to talk to students. And I'm sure that's kind of a big part for a lot of people that I'm connected to on LinkedIn now, is because of that opportunity to just put my content out there and have people just find it on Google and try things out, and yell at me when things
Yeah.
don't work. So it's been a cool experience. I've gotten to talk to so many people,
Yeah.
just from that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And your tutorials are still being used by a lot of students, right? It's available on MATLAB. Maybe I'll also add a link to the tutorials in the description or something. But that's really, so you got these opportunities, and then you realized that, yeah, okay, I'm good at this, and I like this, and I want to do more of this stuff. And then at what point did you then decide that I want to begin my career as a robotics software engineer full time?
I think that there's always been a tension with that, like, because actually, in those three jobs, even at MathWorks, I did take some time in between a couple of those to try my hand at doing software engineering.
Hmm.
Um, so that was like a first try, where I said, because it's always like, I don't know if you've heard the expression that those who cannot do will teach. I don't know if you've heard that. It's
No,
it's kind of
I haven't heard that, but
it's a little bit kind of derogatory to educators, right? It's saying that if you're not like a good engineer or designer, then at least you can teach, which is not true. But
yeah, I mean,
but
there's another
yeah,
quote, right? That if you can't explain something simply, then you don't know it well enough. So,
yeah,
yeah.
that's kind of the opposite. But the reason I bring that up is because there is always that thought in the back of your head, like, okay, I'm teaching people how to do things, but should I not have the experience doing those things myself, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's always been like, hey, I should really try out also engineering. And that first break I took between those two MathWorks jobs was one try at it, which we can talk more about it, but it was
Yeah.
actually one of my career, uh, I wouldn't say failures, but lessons learned. Um, and then I tried again in my transition then to MIT and Boston Dynamics, and that has been going really well. Um, but it is that is I think to be an effective educator, you still need to have some degree of experience. It makes you much better, to have
Yeah.
that balance of actually helping people get sped up with concepts, but also having your own experience getting things that stood up practically, to actually
Yeah.
implement something, because then you can teach that back to people as well. So
Exactly. So I think the two things feed onto each other. So if you have the actual experience, you also become better as an educator because it's the technical stuff you're teaching, right? So that's the
exactly.
thing. And of course, when you're educating people, you probably would spend time creating the content, and you would probably understand the stuff more deeply, and then you could become a better software engineer, let's say, from that. So that's a really interesting journey, Sebastian. So how do you think you have personally evolved over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years, or since you started?
Oof, it's been a lot. I think let's cap it to 5 years, right? Because that's sort of where, like, what I mentioned is that my first couple of jobs really had to do with modeling and simulation. So
Mm,
even though I did some robotics in grad school, I really did find my niche in things like modeling mechatronic systems. So like creating 3D rigid body simulations, modeling electric actuators, hydraulic
mm,
actuators, you
mhm.
know, modeling controllers for that. And that was really what I was focused on for a long time. Um, at some point, as I kind of started getting that itch to get back into robotics, I realized that what most people were doing nowadays was kind of a different level of programming, right? Like there's this entire field of perception, whether it be camera based, lidar based, and techniques to process this data, particularly the resurfacing of machine learning or deep learning, if you will, in like the 2015-ish timeframe. So when I came back to MathWorks for the robotics role, all of a sudden I was not just responsible for the modeling and simulation part, but responsible for that aspect of kind of, if you want to call it artificial intelligence, it's kind of a loaded word,
Mm,
but I had to teach myself all of this, like machine learning, perception, and I did not know about any of these things. I didn't know much about robot manipulators either. So in in that job, I was kind of teaching myself a lot about these new areas of robotics that previously I'd kind of left off to the side because it wasn't my specialty.
Mm-hmm.
And what that involved was, just consuming a lot of content, deriving a lot of math on the side to make sure I understood things. And so while I was doing this job, I actually was fortunate enough to sign up for, I don't know if you've heard of the Udacity nano degrees.
Okay.
So I got to have MathWorks actually like reimburse my tuition for the robotics software engineer nano
Oh
degree
wow.
program, where it was a really nice hands-on way of getting exposure to all these things, and also particularly to learn how to use ROS better, which of course is a huge thing in the robotics space, right?
Yeah.
So that evolution unit started there. I wanted to learn all these techniques. I wanted to learn ROS because at the same time MathWorks had just started coming out with its ROS toolbox, and I needed to know all these concepts so that I could talk to people about it. And next thing you know, like I was becoming like a much more well-rounded robotics person, I suppose. And that kind of got me to the point where I said, okay, this is really cool. I'm learning a lot, but I am working for a company that makes software tools. So at the end of the day, the material that I'm doing is it's how to use a specific set of tools to solve as many robotics problems as it makes sense. What if you flip that on its side and you say, well, what if instead you have a robotics problem to solve, and it doesn't matter what the tool is, there are lots of software tools out there. You have something to solve. Like you have to create a vision algorithm that runs real time. What do you choose? I don't know. Do your research. And I think that was the kind of the last 2 years, since I kind of moved on to MIT and now Boston Dynamics, where I've gone more from a tools focused role to a problem focused role, and I think that has caused a lot of growth in like how you think about engineering problems, right? It's not just like coming up with. It's not like it's not like how do you use this tool to solve my problem, but it's just
Yeah.
I will do whatever it takes to solve this. And I think having that approach to engineering in general is a good thing to have. Yeah.
So essentially, you're talking about how your focus was, of course, when you were working at MathWorks. Your focus was how do I make the right set of videos or content to use this particular tool. But in an engineering or even a research problem, the focus is on the problem statement and how you can, regardless of all which tool you use, you have to solve the problem. And that's a more I think also creative way of focuses on the problem solving side of it. So this is of course, like the evolution has been in a thinking in the way you think, right? So
Yeah.
now you focus now on the engineering problem at hand and how you can solve it in the most efficient way and in the best way possible. So
Exactly.
yeah. So also, I want to discuss about your way of learning. Since you mentioned that you learned all of these things and you refer to these Udacity courses and a lot of other content, and so you probably know the best way to learn from scratch, because also we know that everything is available on the internet, right, these days. So you just need the right way, let's say, to learn. But we
Yeah.
will cover that in the next section.
Hey guys, I really hope that you enjoyed this particular conversation and it helped you in some way, shape, or form. If it did, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification icon or the bell icon so that you can get notified on time whenever the next part is out. Also, it would be really great if you could give me your feedback in the comments below. That would really help me improve. I'm uploading small clips of the long podcasts on a regular basis on platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. So make sure to follow me on these platforms if you're someone who cannot take out time for the long episodes. The podcasts are also available on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify and Google Podcasts.